Hello and welcome again. In this lecture, number 16, we will be dealing with two more diseases, cholera and plague, very deadly ones. So we'll start with cholera. So cholera, also known rightly or wrongly as the Indian or Asiatic cholera, was yet another deadly disease and a public health challenge in the colonial context in 19th century India. So its deadliness can be seen from these figures. It caused around 15 million deaths between 1817 and 1865. And at least before 1817, the disease was by and large confined to rural Bengal, and with sporadic outbreaks among the rural population, which meant that European enclaves in towns and the military were not affected in any serious way. So, which meant that so there wasn't much to be worried. So, as I was indicating in earlier lectures, the real worry starts, the real concerns start when white lives, or especially something wrong happening to military lives, which is what we will see happening. So, in due course, it spread and afflicted not only thousands of Indians elsewhere, but also Europeans and in the northern, eastern parts of India and the rest of India too. And particularly, so this is what, so something we had to wait. The huge number of casualties, especially among the British troops. And in fact, the mortality rate when cholera came, the mortality rate was more among the British troops, as you can see here. So, for every 1,000, 14 fell among the British troop, whereas the part of the Indian troops, it was only 3 per 1,000. This is the statistics from the 1867 cholera epidemic. And in course of time, the annual mortality rate among white troops rose up to 69 per 1,000 due to repeated outbreaks of the cholera epidemic. So therefore, the authorities now took this very seriously, considering this rate of mortality, especially among white troops. So cholera was particularly a challenging disease because it was very confusing in the way it came, the way it spread, and the quickness with which it killed hundreds and thousands of people. So the origins for a long time remained quite hazy, so there was no clear understanding of the actual causes. But as per the largely prevailing trend, the environmental paradigm, the colonial medical establishment related the incidence of this disease to the peculiarities of Indian climate, geography, and topography. So it was cholera was linked to the vagaries of the weather, the atmospheric vicissitudes, and other miasmatic factors like rotting vegetation, crowded habitation, and human filth. It was also linked by some medical investigators to the soil, and of course, the soil in turn also influenced by the same kind of climatic factors like rain and monsoon humidity. While all this was happening, John Snow in London around the 1850s figured out that cholera was transmitted through contaminated water. So while this was the case, so as early as the 1850s, the local medical establishment persisted in its attribution of cholera to air, soil, winds, and the passage of monsoon. And in fact, they worked very hard to produce a statistical evidence to prove and support the above kind of causalities. And also they, as on many other occasions, played up what is called the localist argument. That is, so whatever you may find in London, whatever may be the kind of decisions you arrive at, all said and done, disease in India is not the same as disease in Britain, and we being here, we know better. So this is something which is not just related about the. It's not about the question of the disease and its causality alone. It's also about their relationship with the doctors back home in Britain. So what we would call the doctors at the metropolis or at the center, whereas these in the colonies, these doctors were deemed to be at the periphery. So there is always this center periphery tension or metropolis periphery tension. So those in the metropolis at the center, so they had the tendency, it's doctors or scientists or others, they had the tendency to look down very patronizingly on their own. So these are, we are talking about Englishmen only. So Englishmen there in the metropolis and Englishmen here at the periphery. So there was a tendency of men in the metropolis looking down very patronizingly upon the Englishmen here, sometimes very sympathetic to the very difficult conditions in which they were working, all that. So there was naturally a complex and an urge to assert themselves, those in the periphery, to assert themselves whenever an occasion arose. So this was one such occasions where they touted this idea of disease in India is not the same as disease in Britain, and we being here, we know better. The theories that we come with are better fit to explain the kinds of symptoms and the way the disease unfolds itself and where we are. So that is something also we should keep in mind. Generally, this is an attitude which will recur in other contexts too. So therefore, they downplayed the safe water supply aspect and insisted more, as usual, on general sanitation, removal of filth, addressing miasmas and other such things. And of course, they also made correlations to correlations between cholera and regular Hindu festivals, pilgrimages, gatherings, and the particular routes through which some of these pilgrimages happen. And so, in a way, then this meant that it was acknowledged that humans had some role in it. But of course, not clear about what exactly was the connection, human connection. But contagionism should never come to the forefront, because as I have been saying in a couple of other lectures, so they held anti-contagionism very sacred, and Cunningham, who was the Government of India's Sanitary Commissioner, was a great advocate of it, and he steadfastly defended it to the very end. So he believed in local causes of cholera outbreaks, though human beings were involved, and so we already know the reason for this, why he was not only advocating this but also suppressing contagious views, or anyone who was opposed to anti-contagious views. So the reason for that was the fear of interfering too much. So if he felt that if he made too much of human connection and contagion connection, then there would be need for too much of interference and control of pilgrimages and fairs. So that was the reason why he steadfastly espoused, at least one of the main reasons. And even when this connection was made, human connection was made, so there was, of course, it was very visible there was some connection between these pilgrimage activities and Hindu festivals and cholera. But for that also he had an explanation. So these correlations he attributed to the fatigue level of the people. So it was not that they carried a contagion, but there are other factors there, the excessive fatigue and the privation, the separation from family, so which made them more vulnerable. So it's not that they were responsible in any direct way as carrying some kind of a contagion. And so therefore he was against any intrusive measures to control fairs and pilgrimages. And famine was also presented as one of the crucial factors in the spread of the disease, because famine had its own attributes which could be correlated to this, like factors like malnourishment, which made them physically vulnerable, and also famine affected people were kept in relief camps, and their crowded presence in such camps with the insanitary conditions. So these are the kinds of connections that were made between famine and cholera. Another important significant development in this fight against cholera was the coming of the Cholera Commission. Someone as big and as famous as Robert Koch himself came as part of the Cholera Commission. So Robert Koch, as you know, was very instrumental in what would become the new etiology at that time for all times to come, which is the germ theory of disease, to which we subscribe to in a big way now. So he was one of those who were instrumental, the germ theory of disease. So that's one thing we have to constantly keep in mind. So whether we are discussing about cholera or malaria or smallpox, so before the 1880s, so there was no idea of the role of germs and pathogens. So that is something we should constantly keep in mind. So, and of course, that's generally a point in history we should keep in mind. We should not insert into the past some of the insights we have now with the benefit of hindsight. So the past should be seen in its own light and without any kind of anachronism that is inserting into it aspects of the present. So this is a good example. So we shouldn't, when we think of smallpox at that time, say in 1810 or 1830, so we should totally clear our mind about of all the ideas about germs and how they are transmitted and other such things. So that will help us better understand the challenges. So of course, so we are now on our way to the germ theory. So Koch himself identified the Bacillus, which caused the cholera. So he identified it in 1884, and he located the traces of them in a reservoir, a tank, right at the heart of the British Empire, India, right in Calcutta, its capital city. But all said and done, the local establishment was too entrenched in its own theories, and which are by and large related to the environmental paradigm. So it was reluctant to accept. But as I said, cholera was becoming a huge challenge, especially to white lives, and whatever theories that are in favor, whatever theories are accepted or not accepted, the action had to be initiated on the ground given the seriousness of the challenges posed. And of course, so the special interest was manifested by the setting up of several inquiries and commissions. So as part of moving forward, while the meteorological, that is weather related, environmental paradigm related theories bias towards those theories continued, there was some gradual seeping in of the contagionist perspective. So apart from the usual sanitary measures like sanitary cordons, so there were also new voices which advocated the regulation of water supply and restriction of movement of people. So as we just saw, Robert Koch had identified contaminated water as a problem. So there was some insistence on supplying pure or reasonably purified water. So even with regard to pilgrims, so there were plans to keep them in special camps where proper water supply, so rather than they drinking from some wayside stream or lake or pond, so these camps had a pure water supply with in places where they were properly accommodated, and not only accommodation but also hospitals. along their path, so that all this means that now they are being seen as carriers of contagions, and advisable to keep them away from the main areas town. So by providing these things as much as possible along their usual routes, the accommodation and the pure water supply and or reasonably pure water supply and hospital along those routes, they are prevented from entering the main towns in search of accommodation on their pilgrimage routes. That, as usual, cost, finance will be one of the factors which should stand on the way. So these, of course, all of these involve a lot of costs. There's accommodation, provision of pure water, and hospitals, and other such things. There's so many different pilgrimage routes, so many different pilgrimage centers, and the number of people going. So considering all that, so it was a costly affair, and that, as usual, was one of the reasons. But the sanitary measures did provide some results. We saw this point generally when we are talking about sanitary measures. Now we are talking about cholera in particular, the troop mortality, because it all started with concern about troop mortality, and that particularly saw some good results. That domain saw some good results. There was considerable reduction in mortality through relocation of the troops or barracks to healthier locations, and through provision of sanitary apparatus. So that way we can see an interesting point here is how sometimes even wrong theories can lead to right or very useful measures. Of course, they did not believe in the particular etiology proposed by Robert Koch, but now we know, in, for instance, talking about sanitary, how the correlation between sanitary measures and how it reduced cholera. So now we know in retrospect, so again in retrospect, we know how, for instance, that very causative germ is spread through fecus. So, and it's that fecus, when it gets mixed with water, then that's one of the ways in which it's transmitted. So now, without knowing that connection, since they were concentrating as one of the aspects of sanitary measures, would, as you can imagine, involve the proper disposal of fecus. So such sanitary measures, though it was done for other reasons, coming generally into the environmental paradigm, just trying to keep the atmosphere clean so that miasmas are minimized. So that was the theory, and because of that, they did introduce some kinds of measures which resulted in the coming down of cholera deaths. So this can happen in life also. Sometimes we may not understand, or we may have a wrong understanding of the problem, but still we can end up doing the right things. Now moving on to plague. So plague again has a long global history, and in the Indian context, in the Indian colonial context, it particularly shot up with the deadly outbreak of the disease in Bombay in 1896-97. So more than 400 deaths were recorded India-wide by the end of the century, so in about 3-4 years, and again another 8 million by the time the World War started. And another important aspect of plague like cholera was the danger that it had in spreading to other countries. Of course, we'll have a separate lecture on epidemics and the international dimensions and challenges and compulsions. And so apart from whatever was happening to the Indians and to the British lives, so there was also this danger of its spread, and a related thread of the international community of imposing embargo against the ships from Indian ports, especially at the International Sanitary Conference at Venice in February 1897. Again, we'll be discussing in detail in that lecture on the international dimensions. So one point we have to notice is that especially now in the current context, we are hearing a lot about WHO, the World Health Organization, and the international collaboration, cooperation, concern about health. So all these have their beginnings in the later half of the 19th century, when health became a international issue. And one such manifestation of it was this periodic conferences, sanitary conferences in this case. So in such fora, there was this constant raking up of the dangers from India through cholera or plague. So therefore, so earlier, as we saw, the danger to British lives or troops within India was one of the main propelling factors. Now there's a new dimension. So danger to their own trade, international trade, is also the international pressure. So all of these resulted in the introduction of the Epidemic Diseases Act in 1897. So this authorized the compulsory hospitalization of plague suspects, because plague was something which could very easily spread, and so much so that even the households, the buildings had to be destroyed. And so this act provided for that, and also for the examination of people, passengers in trains, and of course banning of fairs and pilgrimages where there was increased livelihood of the spread. So plague committees were formed to implement some of these, and the even municipal acts were changed. For instance, in 1888, to permit disinfection of, so if not destroying the whole household, but at least so compulsorily going and disinfecting infected dwellings, the destruction of suspected goods, not only buildings but suspected goods, and the removal, compulsory removal of persons to hospitals, and also isolation of infected houses and their inhabitants, as long as it was considered necessary. And the municipal plague committees were sometimes replaced by bodies which were headed by military men, and hardly any medical representative, or just one representative. So this also shows the kind of direction that these measures took, more militaristic, disciplining, repressive, and which will have its own repercussions, as we will see later. So they had the power, these bodies had the power to segregate people in special camps, and again there were cultural factors, so people couldn't be just like that put together, and even in isolation they couldn't be put together. So there are these issues of caste and religion, according to which they had to be divided, again as a kind of allowance to local sensitivities. And these bodies again were empowered to inspect and detain railway passengers. So not only check them, but they could be detained from further travel or from going home if they were suspected of having plague. And one of the symptoms of plague was kind of a swelling in the groins and in the armpit. So people in public places had their armpits checked, and so this was particularly sensitive when it came to women. So unlike the kinds of screens, protections we have, for instance, in the airport, so when ladies are checked, you see there's some kind of a screen which is provided. So such things were not there in the railway station. They're just like that. So in the open, their armpits were examined, which again had local cultural repercussions. That's why the international community, which was calling for some kind of measures, for which it was putting pressure, so they were assuaged, but then the local populace, as you would have guessed by now, by the kinds of things I was saying, so you would have guessed there were a lot of negative feelings and discontent, which provoked widespread protests and resistance. So there was a lot of social unrest, and thousands of people feared. Thousands of people actually left their actual places, something which we saw also during the COVID pandemic, especially workers rushing to railway stations to catch the earliest train to go back home because of the panic that was created. Here, the reason was the fear of compulsory hospitalization or compulsory cordoning off, and also the also apart from the provisions, the way that they were implemented. So, because many of these plague officers were an authoritarian frame of mind, um, comparatively, relatively young officers, so who favored compulsory segregation, implemented very strictly rather than expecting voluntary cooperation from the people. And in the IMS2, the dominant opinion was that the only practical method of preventing and controlling plague was to evacuate the houses or other buildings in which plague had appeared. But slowly, for various reasons, it was realized that the segregation, evacuation, and disinfection was impractical and ineffective. So it was also seen as something very difficult because of the indifference, carelessness, and non-cooperation of people who would particularly not listen to any advice. And that's something I think which many of us would have also seen during the COVID pandemic. So people are itching to come out while the government kept pleading not to come out, not to go on the streets. So that is even with the case of educated and reasonably well-off people. So here, so we find indifference attributed to especially the poor people who would not accept advices, and the railway companies also were concerned about unrest at stations. So for the kinds of things I mentioned, the way the people were checked, so they were railway authorities were worried about unrest and disruption of services, both passenger and freight services. So this was the plague committee to have some kind of a reconsideration of its approach. And also the Indian Plague Commission was appointed in 1898. And based on its recommendations, the government of India liberalized some of its plague policies. In the place of detention camps, surveillance system was introduced. So people are being watched and not immediately rushed to detention camps. And now, with the advance of science and understanding of the disease, of its etiology, the cause the disease, so now it was clearly understood that it was caused by a flea which was carried by a rat. So one could now focus more on them, the flea and the rat, rather than evacuating people or houses and areas wholesale. So it could have a very targeted approach. And of course, in this case also, as in smallpox, inoculation was a very viable option. And the pioneer here was Hafkin, who was already in India, and in fact he developed the plague vaccine within India. So this is something we have to note, especially again in the context of COVID, where we are talking about production, large-scale production, for instance, within India itself. So here it's even one step further. So the vaccine itself was actually invented here. So unless the COVID case where that particular vaccine was invented elsewhere in Oxford, and it was produced in a huge quantity here. So here, so even that's why in terms of center-periphery relationship, this is of considerable significance. So here in the periphery, the vaccine was invented and was also produced, and therefore, given that this was now available, this facility was available, the inoculation was proactively encouraged, both at the level of the central government and the provincial and local governments. So there was a call for universal vaccination, so vaccinating everyone through various propaganda, like reaching out to the people through vernacular language newspapers. And also government even came forward to provide subsistence allowance for 3 days, because as all of us know, vaccination could have some effect for 2-3 days, which might prevent us from doing our normal duties. So for that, there was a subsistence allowance for 3 days. So all that. So as early as that period, and there were also other goodies announced for people who went for vaccination. So they would be exempted. So people who had the vaccine the previous 6 months would be exempted from any kind of segregation unless newly infected. So therefore, inoculation was quickly adopted, not only because of the government proactive propaganda, but also because of the efficacy that was very evident. And therefore, there was even more production of anti-plague inoculations. And interestingly, so not only for usage here in India, but also it was being made for use in other British possessions elsewhere. And this is also something which we can correlate to what we had seen recently, how India has been a supplier, vaccine supplier for a considerable part of the world. So these are some of the connections. In fact, we will have a separate lecture on tutorial, in fact, on some of the parallels between some of these epidemics and the kinds of things which we ourselves witnessed in our own lifetime during a huge pandemic of COVID. So that is for another day. So we'll close here today in this lecture. Thank you.